There are books that shape history, books that change governments, books that spark revolutions. And then there are books that should not exist at all. Hidden today behind glass in the quiet halls of the Swedish National Library, there rests a manuscript so enormous, so strange, that scholars still struggle to explain it. It is nearly 3 feet tall, weighs more than 70 pounds, bound in wood and leather that has survived 7 centuries. Its pages are made from the skins of animals long turned to dust. But size alone is not what makes this book infamous. What makes it infamous is the legend of how it was written. Because according to the oldest accounts, this book was created in a single night. Not by a monk, not by a scribe, but by something the monk called upon in desperation. Something that answered, and left its mark inside the pages. A mark so disturbing that even modern historians hesitate when they turn to that page. A full-page portrait of the devil. And so the manuscript came to be known by a name whispered in monasteries and libraries for centuries. The Devil's Bible, the Codex Gigas. And the story of how it came into the world is darker than most people realize. You are listening to Vox Noctis, where the dark speaks and we listen. Tonight we open one of the strangest manuscripts ever created. A book written in silence, in desperation, and perhaps in the presence of something watching. The story begins in the early years of the 13th century, in a place so remote that even the maps of the age struggled to remember it. Deep in the forests of what is now the Czech Republic, far from the roads of merchants and the armies of kings, there stood a Benedictine monastery. It was not grand, not the kind of monastery whose towers pierced the sky or whose libraries drew scholars from distant lands. This one was smaller, older, and lonelier. Its walls were built from thick blocks of grey stone dragged from nearby hillsides centuries earlier. The stones were rough, heavy, and cold to the touch, stacked so tightly that winter winds could not slip through their seams. Those walls served 2 purposes. They kept out the brutal storms that swept across the Bohemian countryside each winter, and they kept out the violence of the world beyond the forest. Because the 1200s were not gentle years. Wars between kingdoms were constant. Bandits stalked the roads. Villages burned as easily as dry leaves. But behind the monastery walls, the world moved differently. Time itself seemed to slow. Life inside followed a rhythm older than any king. Before dawn, bells called the monks from their narrow wooden beds. Prayer filled the chapel while darkness still clung to the sky. Afterward came labour. Fields tended in silence, animals fed, bread baked in stone ovens. Then study and writing. Hours spent hunched over wooden desks beneath the trembling glow of candles. Because in that age, books were not printed. They were born. Each page began as animal skin scraped thin and stretched into parchment. Ink was ground by hand, quills sharpened with knives. Every letter written slowly, deliberately, with a patience that bordered on devotion. A single mistake could ruin a page that took weeks to prepare. So the monks wrote carefully. One letter, then another, then another. Line after line, hour after hour, while wax from the candles dripped slowly across the desks like pale tears. Creating even a modest manuscript could take years. Larger works might consume the better part of a lifetime. Books were among the most precious objects on earth, more valuable than gold, more enduring than stone. And within that quiet monastery, among men who had sworn their lives to silence, obedience, and prayer, there lived a monk whose name has vanished from history. No chronicle records it. No grave marker bears it. The centuries have swallowed it completely. But his story survived, because according to the oldest accounts preserved in the margins of medieval records, this monk committed a crime so grave, so shocking, that the brothers of the monastery believed only one punishment could cleanse the offence. It was a punishment rarely spoken of, even in those harsh centuries. He would not be executed. He would not be exiled. Instead, he would be sealed alive inside the monastery walls, entombed in stone, left alone in darkness, to wait for death to come slowly. And when the sentence was announced, the monks began preparing the chamber, because at sunrise, the wall would be closed forever. No surviving record tells us exactly what the monk had done. The chronicles are strangely silent on that detail. Only fragments remain, scattered references in later writings, whispers preserved in marginal notes scratched into parchment centuries ago. Some historians believe the monk violated his sacred vows. The Benedictine order demanded absolute obedience, humility, silence, devotion. A single act of rebellion against those vows could bring severe punishment. Others believe the crime was darker, that the monk had pursued knowledge the Church considered forbidden, not simply heresy, something more dangerous. Texts that spoke of spirits, ancient writings outlawed by bishops, books copied in secret and hidden beneath monastery floors. There are even rumours, preserved in old folklore, that he attempted rituals meant to summon powers not meant for human hands. But no document confirms any of these claims. What we do know is the punishment, and the punishment tells us something terrible must have happened, because the monks chose a sentence rarely carried out, even in the brutal centuries of medieval Europe. The man would not be executed. He would not be banished. Instead, he would be entombed alive. A narrow chamber inside the monastery walls had already been prepared. A small stone room, bare, windowless, barely large enough for a man to sit. Once inside, masons would seal the entrance with stone and mortar. The wall would close, and the monk would disappear into darkness forever. The sentence would be carried out at dawn. All night the brothers of the monastery prepared the chamber. Candles flickered in the corridors. Stone blocks were stacked beside the opening. Mortar was mixed. The quiet rituals of death had already begun. But sometime before midnight, the condemned monk made a final request. he asked to speak with the abbots. The senior monks gathered in the chapter hall, a cold stone chamber where discipline was handed down and vows were sworn. The condemned man stood before them, chains at his wrists, exhaustion hollowing his face. But according to the legend, there was something else in his eyes, something desperate, and something determined. He made them an offer, a promise so outrageous that at first the monks believed he had lost his mind. He said he would create a book, not an ordinary manuscript, not a small devotional text copied from older works, but a book containing all human knowledge, a single volume that would gather together the wisdom of the world, the Holy Scriptures, history, medicine, spiritual teachings, knowledge preserved from the ancient world, a manuscript so magnificent that scholars would travel from distant kingdoms just to see it, a book that would make the monastery famous for centuries, a treasure greater than gold. And then he said something even more unbelievable. He promised to finish it in a single night. The monks stared at him in silence. Some laughed. Others whispered prayers under their breath. They knew the work of scribes. They knew how long it took to prepare parchment, to grind ink, to form every careful letter. Even the most experienced scribes needed years to complete large manuscripts, sometimes decades. What the monk proposed was not merely difficult, it was impossible. But desperation has a way of bending judgment, and curiosity can be just as powerful as mercy. The abbots considered the offer. If the monk failed, nothing would change. The wall would close at dawn as planned. But if by some miracle he succeeded, the monastery would gain a treasure beyond imagination. So the abbots made their decision. They accepted the bargain. If the monk completed the book before sunrise, his life would be spared. If he failed, the wall would close forever. The condemned man was escorted into the chamber where the work would begin. A heavy wooden door shut behind him. Candles were placed around a rough wooden table. Parchment sheets were stacked beside him. Ink, quills, everything a scribe would need. Then the monks left. The corridor outside fell silent. The door remained closed. And somewhere in the monastery, the bells marked the passing of midnight. Inside the chamber, the monk sat alone, candles flickering against the stone walls, ink waiting on the table, and only a few hours until dawn. Slowly, he lifted the quill, dipped it into the black ink, and began to write. At first, the monk worked with a kind of grim determination. He sat hunched over the rough wooden table, the quill gripped tightly between stiff fingers. The faint glow of candlelight dancing across the parchment before him. The chamber was silent except for one sound. The scratch of ink. Scratch. Pause. Scratch again. The quill dragged across the animal skin with a dry whisper that seemed far louder in the stillness of the room. Line after line formed beneath his hand. Letters carefully shaped, words assembled. Scripture first, because that was what the abbots would expect. The monk's breathing slowed as he worked, falling into the familiar rhythm of the scriptorium. Ink, letter, word, line. For a while, he almost forgot the stone chamber around him, almost forgot the sentence that waited with the sunrise. But the hours did not stop. Outside the chamber, the monastery bells marked the passing of time, one slow toll for the first watch of the night, another for the second, each echo drifting faintly through the stone corridors like a reminder of the approaching dawn. And slowly, the terrible truth began to settle over him. The pages before him barely grew. The stack of blank parchment remained impossibly tall, and the candle flames began to shrink. The monk's hand faltered. The quill paused above the page. He did the math that every scribe understood instinctively. A single page might take hours. This book would require hundreds, even if he wrote without pause, without sleep, without food. It would take years. Years he did not have. The monk leaned back in the chair. His fingers trembled. The ink on the page had barely begun to dry, and already the candles had burned halfway down their stems. Their wax dripped slowly across the table like pale tears. The shadows on the walls seemed to grow longer, stretching across the stone like reaching fingers. The chamber felt smaller now, the air heavier, the walls closer. Somewhere above him, faint footsteps echoed through the monastery halls as the brothers moved through their midnight prayers. But down here, there was only the scratching silence of the chamber and the knowledge that death waited with the sunrise. The monk closed his eyes. For a moment, he whispered prayers under his breath, words he had spoken 1,000 times in chapel, words meant to call upon mercy. But even as the prayer passed his lips, he knew mercy would not come. No miracle would grant him the speed needed to finish the book. No divine hand would move the quill for him. And so, according to the legend preserved in later accounts, the monk made a choice that would echo through centuries of whispers. Slowly, he pushed the parchment aside. The quill fell from his fingers onto the wooden table. His hands folded together, not in devotion, but in desperation. He bowed his head, and he began to pray again. But this time, he did not call upon God. He called upon another presence, a being spoken of only in warnings and sermons, a being the monks believed walked the shadows of the world, waiting for moments of weakness, waiting for bargains, waiting for souls willing to trade eternity for survival. The monk whispered into the darkness, his voice barely louder than breath. Promises, offers, a plea for power, for speed, for the impossible. Outside the chamber, the monastery slept. Inside, the candles flickered violently as if stirred by a wind that did not exist. The monk stopped speaking. The room grew very still. And then, according to the legend, something answered, not with a voice, not with footsteps, but with a presence, a weight in the air, thick and suffocating, as though the darkness itself had leaned closer to listen. The candle flames bent sideways. The shadows on the walls twisted into shapes that did not match the objects that cast them, and the monk realized something terrifying. He was no longer alone in the chamber. Something had come. Something ancient. Something patient. Something willing to finish the book. Morning came slowly to the monastery. The eastern sky beyond the forest began to pale, turning from black to deep grey as the first light of dawn crept across the hills of Bohemia. Inside the monastery walls, the brothers gathered in uneasy silence. Few of them had slept. All night they had waited, listening to the bells mark the passing hours. Midnight, then the second watch, then the third, and with each toll of the bell, the same thought crept through their minds. Soon the wall would close. Soon the condemned monk would disappear into stone. But first, they had to see whether the impossible had happened. The abbots walked the narrow corridor toward the chamber. Their sandals echoed softly across the stone floor. Behind them followed several other monks, drawn by curiosity and dread in equal measure. The air in the corridor felt colder than usual. The door to the chamber stood exactly as they had left it. Closed. Silent. No sound came from within. One of the abbots placed his hand upon the iron latch. For a moment, he hesitated. Then the door opened. The hinges groaned as the heavy wood swung inward. Morning light spilled into the chamber, and what they saw inside stopped them where they stood. The monk was still alive. He sat slumped at the table, pale and motionless, as though every ounce of strength had been drained from his body. But that was not what held their attention. Spread across the table before him, and stacked in careful piles along the floor, lay a manuscript. Not a few pages, not a small text begun in desperation, but an enormous book, hundreds of pages thick, bound together in heavy parchment sheets. The monks stepped closer in stunned silence. One of them lifted a page. The writing was flawless. Every letter shaped with the same precise hand. Every line perfectly straight. Every word identical in size and spacing to the one before it. It did not look like the work of a man who had struggled through the night. It looked mechanical, as though some invisible instrument had traced the letters with impossible precision. Page after page revealed the same perfection. Scripture, histories, medical texts, rituals. Entire volumes of knowledge copied with terrifying speed. The monks looked at one another in disbelief. Even if a scribe worked without sleep, without pause, without error, such a book should have taken decades. Yet here it was, complete, finished before sunrise. And then one of the brothers turned another page, and the room seemed to grow colder. The parchment before them was almost entirely filled by a single image, not of a saint, not of a martyr, not of the Virgin or the Apostles, but of something else. Something no medieval monk should ever have painted into a sacred manuscript. The creature towered across the page. Its body crouched like a beast. Clawed hands spread wide against the parchment. its skin coloured an unnatural greenish tone, stretched tightly across thin limbs. 2 red horns rose sharply from its head, and its eyes seemed to stare directly out of the page, not at the monks as a group, but at each of them, individually. The expression was neither rage nor sorrow. It was something worse. Recognition. A silent awareness of the reader. The devil. The monks recoiled. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered hurried prayers under their breath. They had seen depictions of demons before. Medieval manuscripts were filled with warnings of hell and temptation. But nothing like this. This image was different. It was not symbolic. It was not exaggerated. It felt deliberate, confrontational, as though the artist had wanted the reader to meet the devil's gaze directly. And then one of the abbots noticed something else. The page immediately before the illustration was completely blank. An empty sheet of parchment. No writing, no decoration, no ink. Just untouched parchment, as though the scribe had stopped his work entirely, as though the quill had been set down, and whatever came next had not been written by human hands. The monks turned slowly toward the man at the table, the monk who had promised to create the impossible. He sat there motionless, eyes open but hollow, and for a moment none of them spoke, because every man in that chamber was thinking the same terrible thought. The book had been written, but perhaps the monk had not written it alone. The manuscript that emerged from that chamber would later be given a name that sounded almost mythical. Codex Gigas, the giant book. And the name was not exaggeration. Even today, when visitors stand before the manuscript inside the Swedish National Library, the first thing they notice is not its age, but its size. The Codex Gigas is one of the largest medieval manuscripts ever created. Nearly 3 feet tall, more than 20 inches wide, thick enough to require both arms to lift. The entire volume weighs close to 75 pounds, heavier than most armour worn by soldiers of the same century. Opening it feels less like reading a book and more like uncovering an artifact. Its pages are not paper. They are parchment, sheets of animal skin scraped thin, stretched and polished until they could receive ink. Researchers have estimated that the manuscript required the skins of more than 160 animals to create. Hundreds of lives, transformed into pages. And there are many pages, over 600 of them, every one filled with writing, every one carefully ruled with invisible lines to guide the scribe's hand. When scholars began studying the Codex Gigas centuries later, they discovered something astonishing about its contents. The book is not simply a Bible. It is a library. Inside its enormous pages are texts drawn from across the intellectual world of the Middle Ages. The entire Latin Bible appears within its columns of ink, but the scriptures are only the beginning. The manuscript also contains detailed medical treatises describing illnesses and cures known to medieval physicians, ancient chronicles recounting the history of the Jewish people, astronomical tables tracking the movements of stars and planets, legal texts, penitential guides, and long sections devoted to the subject medieval monks feared more than almost anything else. Spiritual warfare, exorcism rituals, prayers meant to drive away unseen forces, warnings about demons and the corruption of the soul. The Codex Gigas is not merely a religious book. It is a compendium of knowledge as it was understood in the 13th century. A book that attempts to gather the entire intellectual world of medieval Europe between two covers. But when modern scholars studied the manuscript more closely, they discovered something even stranger. The handwriting never changes. From the first page to the last, the same elegant script appears on every line. The letters maintain the same shape, the same spacing, the same rhythm. Even the pressure of the quill appears identical throughout the entire book. This means something remarkable. Despite its enormous size, despite its hundreds of pages, the entire Codex Gigas was written by a single scribe. One man, one hand, one mind. But that discovery only deepened the mystery. Because when historians calculated how long such a work should take, the answer was staggering. A skilled medieval scribe could produce perhaps 2 carefully written pages in a full day of work, sometimes fewer. And the Codex Gigas contains more than 600. Even if the monk worked every day, 8 hours without fail, never stopping, never making mistakes, never falling ill, the book would still require at least 20 years to complete. 20 years of steady labour. 20 years of ink and parchment and candlelight. And that estimate assumes a single miracle: that the monk never slept, never faltered, never paused. But the legend tells a very different story. According to the oldest accounts, the book was written in a single night, which leaves historians facing an uncomfortable question. If the story of one night is impossible, then something else must explain the manuscript. And that question becomes even darker when one turns to the most infamous page in the entire book. Because somewhere in the middle of the Codex Gigas, the text suddenly stops, and the reader is confronted with an image unlike anything else in medieval literature. A full-page portrait of the devil. And the real mystery may not be how the book was written, but why the monk chose to include that image at all. The devil portrait inside the Codex Gigas is not decorative. It is not a small illustration tucked between passages of text. It is not one of the playful, grotesque creatures that appear in many medieval manuscripts. It is something else entirely. It is confrontational. The illustration occupies nearly the entire page, dominating the parchment in a way that forces the reader to stop, to look, to meet its gaze. The figure stands alone, no background, no landscape, no flames of hell. Just the creature itself, suspended in empty space, as though the parchment could barely contain it. Its body crouches forward slightly, almost as if it is leaning toward the viewer. The arms are raised, the long fingers spread wide, tipped with sharp red claws that seem to press against the edges of the page. Its skin is painted a sickly green tone, stretched tightly across a thin, unnatural frame. 2 horns rise from the sides of its head, and its face is impossible to ignore. The eyes are wide, round, alert. They do not appear angry, they do not appear tortured. Instead, they seem aware, as though the creature knows it is being seen, as though the reader has not discovered the devil, but the devil has discovered the reader. The mouth is open slightly, a thin red tongue visible between sharp teeth. Not screaming, not laughing, but waiting. And perhaps the most unsettling detail of all is the stillness. There are no surrounding figures, no angels, no flames, no saints driving the demon away. The devil stands alone on the page, unchallenged, unopposed, as if the book itself has paused to allow this presence to appear. Then the reader turns the page, and suddenly the tone changes completely. Opposite the devil's portrait is another full-page illustration, a vision of the heavenly city, the kingdom of God. Golden towers rise upward in careful symmetry. Walls stand tall and perfect. Gates open toward a bright and ordered world beyond. The image is calm, balanced, serene. Heaven on one page, hell on the other. Two worlds facing each other across a thin sheet of parchment. The symbolism is powerful, and historians have debated its meaning for centuries. Some scholars believe the monk was creating a warning, a reminder that every soul must choose between salvation and damnation. Others suggest the portrait may have served a ritual purpose, a symbolic representation of the devil meant to weaken his influence through exposure. But there is another theory, a darker one that is rarely spoken aloud in academic halls, because that theory suggests the portrait was not meant to condemn the devil or warn against him. It was meant to acknowledge him, to record his presence, almost like a signature left within the pages of the book. And when readers encounter that image today, some report an unsettling feeling they struggle to explain, a sense that the illustration is not simply a drawing, but a presence, something that seems to stare back, not with rage, not with hatred, but with quiet recognition, as though the creature on that page knows exactly why the book was written, and who helped write it. The Codex Gigas did not remain hidden in that monastery forever. Like many relics born in the Middle Ages, its history became tangled with the violence of Europe. For centuries, the enormous manuscript passed quietly from one generation of monks to another. It survived storms that collapsed roofs. It survived the slow decay of monasteries abandoned by changing times. And it survived something far more destructive: war. Throughout the centuries, armies marched across the lands of Bohemia again and again. Kingdoms rose, kingdoms fell. Cities burned. Libraries were plundered. Books, those fragile vessels of knowledge, were often the first things to vanish in the chaos. Yet somehow, the Codex Gigas endured. It survived fires that consumed entire buildings. It survived political upheaval that shattered monasteries and scattered their treasures. And then, in the 17th century, its journey took a darker turn. During the 30 Years' War, one of the most brutal conflicts in European history, Swedish armies swept across Central Europe. Cities were looted, churches emptied, libraries stripped of their rarest manuscripts. And among the countless objects taken as spoils of war was the enormous volume known as the Codex Gigas. The book was carried north across the continent, across forests, across rivers, across battle-scarred roads, until it reached Stockholm. There, in the Swedish Royal Library, the manuscript found a new home. Behind thick walls, under careful watch, protected from the destruction that had devoured so many other relics of the Middle Ages. And yet, even in safety, the book continued to gather stories. Librarians who worked closely with the manuscript began describing strange feelings when studying its pages. Not fear exactly, but the persistent sense of being observed. Some reported that when they turned to the famous devil portrait, the expression seemed subtly different depending on the light. Under one angle, it appeared calm. Under another, almost amused. Others claimed the creature's eyes seemed to follow their movement across the room. A trick of the mind, perhaps. A side effect of studying the same unsettling image for too long. Still, not every librarian was willing to test that explanation. Over time, some researchers quietly refused to open the book at all. They would catalogue it, protect it, store it, but they would not sit alone with the Codex Gigas for extended periods. Not after dark, not in silence. Even today, centuries after its creation, the manuscript remains one of the most mysterious artifacts of the medieval world. Scholars have studied its materials in extraordinary detail. They have analysed the ink, measured the parchment, examined the stitching of its binding. Every physical element of the book can be explained. The skins, the pigments, the techniques used by the medieval scribe. All of it makes sense. Except for one thing. The question that still lingers between the pages. Why was the book created at all? Why would a monk devote decades of his life, or, according to legend, a single desperate night, to producing a manuscript of such staggering scale? Why gather scripture, science, medicine, history and ritual into one massive volume? And most unsettling of all, why place the image of the devil at its heart? Because sometimes the mystery is not how something was made. Sometimes the mystery is who it was meant for. Before we close the pages of this story, there is one final question worth asking. The Codex Gigas still exists. It still rests quietly inside the Swedish National Library, preserved behind glass and controlled light. Visitors pass by it every year. Most see only a strange relic from the Middle Ages, an enormous book, a curiosity. But those who linger longer often notice something unsettling. That portrait, the devil staring out from the page, a single image that has survived 7 centuries, watching every new reader who stops to look. And historians still cannot answer the question that haunts the manuscript. Was the legend simply a story told to frighten future generations? A medieval myth created to explain an extraordinary book? Or did something truly happen in that stone chamber long ago? Something desperate enough that a monk might have tried to call upon a power he believed could finish the impossible? And if he did something answer? I'd like to hear what you think. Do you believe the Codex Gigas is simply the work of a determined medieval scribe who spent decades writing the largest manuscript of his time? Or do you believe the legend survived for a reason? That the monk may have made a bargain, and the devil's portrait inside the book is not just an illustration, but a reminder of who helped finish it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the most unsettling stories in history are the ones that leave us with questions we cannot easily dismiss. And if you enjoy exploring mysteries hidden in forgotten history, strange legends preserved in ancient manuscripts, and the darker corners of the past where belief and fear often meet, consider subscribing to Vox Noctis, because the past is full of voices that still whisper across the centuries. Some are warnings, some are confessions, and some may be something else entirely. Until next time, keep your eyes open and be careful which pages you turn, because some books are not meant to be read aloud.